Cheap sex is a phenomenon in which the act of sexual intercourse is starting to lose value from a physically intimate act to a act you do on a Saturday night.
Sex that isn't meaningful.
Sex is sex that is obtained easily.
Cheap sex is sex basically without strings or emotional attachment, something easy to attain and doesn't require a lot of effort.
I think it's definitely changed. It's a lot more casual now than it used to be back in our parents' time.
With the rise of cheap sex, there's been a fluctuation in the values of society. For example, some people may think that sex is much less of a final communion between two people and more of just a physical act or something you can do on a much more common basis. And because cheap sex has become so pervasive in today's society, I'm starting to see the interactions change a little bit between people, and you can take an extreme approach and say you are beginning to commoditize people, and other people, specifically other genders, may be a tool or a mean towards an end. So this is an extreme approach. The other end of the spectrum could be the value of sex, and thus the value of family and family building may be diminished in the future.
I think it affects people's ability to have long-term relationships. I think it's a big reason why the divorce rate is a lot higher than it was 20 years ago.
I think it's diminished the value of relationships a good amount. I think relationships are less sought after.
It's very dangerous to put it in a binary, because if you say it's one person's fault, then automatically all blame would be going to that person, and that may constrict any flexibility in changing these viewpoints and changing these ideas. I think it's much more important to ask, how can we make a much more proactive approach? And you can identify some characters that are important and are the key players in the cheap sex phenomenon, things like genders, things like college institutions, or things like fraternities and sororities, who are trying to make this idea of it's fun and it's fine. And this is by no means an overarching statement, but there are stereotypes associated with that. And I feel like if we can isolate them as well as understand why it is this way, you'll have much more of a better understanding of the key players in the cheap sex.
I would say women, because men will do whatever women allow them to do. Women basically have the majority of the power in that situation, because men would probably have sex with a tree if they could get away with it. So, the woman is the one that gives them the green light. So, by that logic, they would have the majority of the responsibility.
It's pretty equal, if anything, maybe on the parents.
And there are no strings attached for the most part. The downside is that there are no strings attached, so sex isn't meaningful, and there's a higher risk of getting an STD or getting pregnant.
I know a lot about the benefits. I would say more of the cost of, like kind of the first question, diminished value of sexual relations and relationships in general.
The benefits would be, satisfying one of our natural urges to have sex. I think one of the costs, though, is I think it affects your psyche when it comes to long-term relationships, because one of the big components of a long-term relationship is valuing the intimacy between two people, and whenever you don't value that as much, it's gonna impede your ability to make deeper emotional connections long term.
Well, the benefits are you have sexual gratification, you have pleasure, you have much more of an immediate benefit, frankly. Now, the costs, there's a time discrepancy you have to recognize, because some people may not find any cost associated with cheap sex right now, but if you start thinking of family planning, if you find someone who you end up falling in love with in the future, they may have differing opinions on other than your view. And this may lead to some problems in the long run. There's always going to be the health issues of cheap sex may increase the transfer rate of sexually transmitted diseases. On top of that, the idea of psychological harm that may come up with cheap sex. Cheap sex may demean one gender more than the other. And there's a lot of intangibles that me, being a male, can never recognize, but I do know that there are things I won't be able to ever understand.
So there you have it, ladies and Professor Wilcox. The goal was to bring to perspective some varying views from males on the current state of our relationship union and the topic of cheap sex. So is cheap sex for better or for worse? I'll let you guys decide.